It was one of those gray mornings that seemed to blend into every other day of the week, the kind of morning when the sky looked heavy, the coffee tasted the same, and life felt stuck in slow motion. That was how Daniel's days usually began, quiet, predictable, and a little too ordinary. He worked at a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, fixing cars that always seemed to have the same problems and listening to the same radio station playing the same songs from 10 years ago. Every day felt like a repeat of the one before. He would wake up early, pull on his work boots, grab a cup of cheap coffee from the corner gas station and drive the same route past rows of tired houses and empty lots. The only sound in his truck was the rattle of tools in the back seat. He'd park behind the shop, nod to his boss, and get to work. Daniel wasn't unhappy exactly. He just felt like he was living half a life. He had dreams once, big ones. But dreams didn't pay rent, and rent came due every month. He had bills stacked on the kitchen table, and most nights he'd sit there looking at them like they were enemies he'd never win against. Still, there was something inside him that refused to die. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a quiet kind of hope. He didn't talk about it much, not even to his coworkers. But every once in a while, when the day slowed down, he would catch himself thinking about what else he could be doing. Something that didn't involve grease-stained hands and the constant smell of engine oil. One night, after another long shift, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table with his laptop open. The screen flickered weakly and the Wi-Fi kept cutting out. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was just scrolling through videos to kill time before bed. Then one video caught his eye. The title said something about how a small investment could change your life. He almost skipped it. It sounded like one of those get-rich-quick scams that promised the world and delivered nothing. But something about the thumbnail, an ordinary guy sitting in his garage, surrounded by small gadgets he had built himself, made Daniel click. The man in the video talked about how he had started with nothing but a few $100s and a curiosity about technology. He learned new skills online, made small things, failed a lot, but kept trying. Eventually, one idea worked, and it changed everything for him. Daniel didn't even realize how long he'd been watching. By the time the video ended, his coffee had gone cold, and the clock said it was nearly midnight. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Could that ever happen for him? Could something so small, just a few $100s and a bit of effort, really lead to something bigger? He laughed at himself a little. It sounded too simple. He had always believed that success was for people with connections, college degrees, or lucky breaks. Not for someone like him, a mechanic from a small town with a tired truck and a shrinking bank account. But that night, a thought refused to leave his head. What if it wasn't about luck? What if it was just about trying something new? The next morning, Daniel went back to work as usual. But something was different. As he tightened bolts and changed oil, his mind wasn't on the cars anymore. It was still stuck on that video. Every sound in the shop seemed distant, like his body was there, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. During lunch, he sat outside on the curb behind the shop, unwrapping a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. He searched for things like cheap investments, learn new skills online, and ways to make money from home. The results were endless, some real, some obviously fake, but one thing kept appearing over and over again. Stories about people who had taken a small step that changed everything. Some learned photography and built small online businesses. Others learned coding or graphic design. A few had started making small crafts or tools and selling them online. They weren't overnight millionaires, but their stories sounded real. Ordinary people who had just taken a chance. For the next few weeks, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea sat in the back of his mind while he worked, while he ate dinner, even when he tried to fall asleep. He wanted to do something, but what? He wasn't artistic and he didn't know much about business. Then one evening, while cleaning up his workbench, he noticed a cracked socket wrench lying in a pile of discarded tools. It had broken clean across the handle, something he'd seen 100 times before. Normally, he would just throw it away and grab a new one, but for some reason, he held on to it, turning it over in his hands. He thought about how much money the shop spent replacing tools that wore out. Then he remembered a video he'd seen earlier that week about people 3D printing small replacement parts at home. Simple things like knobs, clips, and handles. The guy in the video had made a replacement part for his lawnmower for less than $1. Daniel didn't know much about 3D printing, but the idea fascinated him. Machines that could make parts on demand? It sounded like science fiction, but apparently it was real. That night, he searched for everything he could about it. He learned that there were affordable 3D printers now, some even under $300. There were free tutorials online, free software, and communities where people helped each other. The more he read, the more excited he became, but then reality hit him. He barely had $500 left in his savings account. That money was supposed to be for emergencies, car repairs, rent if he ever lost his job, things like that. Spending it on a printer and some plastic filament seemed crazy. He closed his laptop and sat there in silence for a long time. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars passing outside. He wanted to believe he could do something different. But fear has a way of sounding like reason. His mind filled with doubts. What if it didn't work? What if it was a waste of money? What if he failed? The next few days were full of back and forth. Every morning he told himself it wasn't worth the risk. Every night he found himself back on the internet, watching people build things, learn things, create things. It made him restless. One Saturday afternoon, after finishing an extra shift at the shop, Daniel stopped by the local hardware store to pick up a few supplies. As he was walking out, he saw a flyer pinned to the community board near the door. It was for a small local class on Introduction to 3D Design. It was a one-day workshop at the library, and it cost only $50. He stared at the flyer for a long time. Maybe this was the sign he needed. He tore off one of the small tabs with the contact number and shoved it into his pocket. The next week, he signed up. The class was small, just a handful of people sitting around laptops. The instructor, a kind older man with glasses, showed them how to design simple shapes and objects using free software. Daniel was hooked immediately. For the first time in years, he felt his brain wake up in a way it hadn't in a long time. It wasn't easy. He fumbled with the software, made mistakes, and got frustrated. But he kept going. When the class ended, the instructor let them print one small item to take home. Daniel made a tiny gear about the size of a coin. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid, real, and made by his own hands. He turned it over again and again, amazed by it. That little gear became his reminder. He kept it on his nightstand, and every time he looked at it, he felt that same spark. The idea that maybe he could do more than just fix other people's tools. Maybe he could make something of his own. Over the next month, Daniel kept researching. He watched hours of tutorials, read reviews, and learned what he could about different printers. He made lists, compared prices, and tried to figure out the cheapest way to start. He still hesitated, though. Every time he hovered over the Buy Now button, his stomach twisted. Then one morning, everything changed. His truck, which had been his old faithful companion for years, broke down on his way to work. The repair bill came to almost $600. He used nearly all his savings to fix it, leaving him with just about $500 in the bank. That night, after paying the mechanic, he sat in his apartment staring at his receipt. He couldn't help but laugh, a tired, frustrated laugh. The money he had been afraid to spend was gone anyway. He had tried so hard to hold on to it, and it still disappeared just like that. That's when he made his decision. If money could disappear so easily doing something he didn't even want, maybe it was time to spend it on something he did. He turned on his laptop, went to the website he had bookmarked weeks ago, and ordered a small beginner 3D printer. The total came to $479. It would arrive in a few days. When he clicked Confirm Purchase, his heart raced. It wasn't just a financial decision. It felt like a personal one. For the first time in years, he was doing something for himself. Something that wasn't safe or predictable, but hopeful. Afterward, he sat quietly for a long time, staring at the confirmation email on the screen. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if it would work or if it would all fall apart. But deep down, something had shifted. The routine, gray world he had lived in for so long suddenly seemed to have a small spark of color. He didn't know it yet, but that $500 click would become the start of something that would change everything. When the 3D printer finally arrived, it felt like Christmas morning. Daniel hadn't been this excited about something in a long time. It wasn't about the machine itself, not really. It was about what it represented, a chance. A small chance to try something different, something new, after feeling stuck for so long. The box was bigger than he expected, and inside, the printer was neatly packed in foam and cardboard. It was basic, nothing fancy, but to him it might as well have been a spaceship. He spent the next hour carefully unpacking everything, setting it up on a table in the corner of his apartment. It didn't look like much yet, just a few plastic pieces, wires, and a small spool of filament. But it was his. He was about to try and create something with it. His mind raced with possibilities. What could he make? How would it work? Was he even going to be able to figure it out? The first thing Daniel did was read through the manual, but the instructions were dry and complicated, filled with technical terms that made his head spin. He pushed through anyway, connecting the wires, plugging in the power cord, and fiddling with the settings. After a few hours of trial and error, the printer was finally ready. He was supposed to print a test object, something simple to make sure everything worked. But even as he set the printer up, there was this knot of nervousness in his stomach. What if it didn't work? What if he broke it before even trying? When he hit the button to start the test print, he watched as the machine hummed to life, its small motor whirring and buzzing. At first, nothing happened. Then the nozzle started to heat up, and slowly, a thin line of plastic began to lay down on the build plate. Daniel leaned in, his eyes glued to the machine. The first layer was a little crooked. The filament didn't stick properly in places. But it was something. It was a start. He let the machine finish the print, watching every minute, holding his breath. Finally, when it was done, he lifted the tiny object off the build plate. It wasn't perfect. It had bumps and rough edges, but it was his first creation. He held it in his hands, feeling a strange sense of pride. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Over the next few days, Daniel spent every free moment he had learning how to use the printer. He watched more YouTube tutorials, read articles, joined online forums. The learning curve was steep. There were moments when he felt like throwing the whole thing out the window. The prints kept failing, the filament kept jamming, and sometimes the machine wouldn't even start. But with each mistake, Daniel got a little better at troubleshooting. He learned to adjust the settings, tweak the design, and experiment with different materials. Each print was a small victory. And even though they weren't perfect, they were starting to feel real. He made a few keychains, a couple of small tools, and even a replacement part for an old bike lock he had. His apartment was soon filled with little plastic objects, most of them clunky and misshapen, but all of them made by his own hands. One evening, while he was working on a new project, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his old boss at the repair shop. "We need a new set of brake parts for the truck. Can you get us something? The usual place is sold out." Daniel sat up straight. For a moment, he just stared at the message. A new set of brake parts? He wasn't sure how it had happened, but something inside him clicked. He could make them. Not the whole set, not yet. But he could make a custom replacement part that might just work. It was a long shot. But he had to try. He went to his laptop and pulled up some designs. Using the 3D design software he'd been playing with, he sketched out a rough model of the part he thought would fit. It wasn't a complicated design, just a simple piece that could potentially solve a small issue with the brakes, but it felt like something important. He could picture it in his mind, how it would fit, how it would work. As he printed the part, Daniel's hands were trembling. What if it didn't fit? What if it broke when they tried to use it? He couldn't shake the fear that all of this would turn out to be a waste of time, that the printer would turn out to be nothing more than an expensive toy. But when the print finished, he carefully pulled the part off the build plate and held it in his hands. It looked almost perfect. The edges were clean, the holes were just the right size, and the shape seemed to match exactly what he needed. He couldn't believe it. The next day, Daniel took the part into work. His boss raised an eyebrow when he saw it, but Daniel just smiled, trying to act confident. He slipped the part into place, making sure everything lined up just right. When he finished, he stepped back and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. But then the truck started right up, the brakes working perfectly just like they were supposed to. His boss, who had been skeptical at first, looked at him in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "You actually did it." Daniel's heart raced. It wasn't much, just a small part, but it was something he had made. And it worked. It was proof that this printer, this strange and new world he'd stepped into, might just be the thing he needed to make something of himself. By the time the workday was over, Daniel's mind was racing. If he could make a part for the truck, maybe he could make other things. Maybe there was a market for custom replacement parts. Maybe he could sell them. That night, he sat at his kitchen table brainstorming ideas. He thought about the small things he'd repaired over the years, tools, machines, even small appliances. People were always looking for cheap parts to fix things rather than buy new. And the best part? With 3D printing, he didn't need to keep a big inventory. He could make parts on demand whenever someone needed them. It was a risky idea, but it felt right. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was on the edge of something big. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Daniel set up a small website and started taking custom orders from friends, co-workers, and even people in the local community. Word spread, and soon he was getting more requests. It wasn't much at first, just a few small orders for custom tools, parts, and fixes. But it was enough to get started. Enough to give him hope that this could turn into something more. He worked late into the night, printing, designing, learning, and tweaking. Each order brought a new challenge, a new opportunity to learn something new. He was still making mistakes, but each mistake taught him something valuable. Even though the business was still small, it was growing. And more importantly, Daniel was learning things he'd never thought he'd be able to learn. He was learning how to create something out of nothing, how to solve problems, and how to take risks. But there was still a long way to go. He had to keep pushing, keep working, and keep believing that this wasn't just some short-lived experiment. He had to believe that the small $500 investment he'd made wasn't just a fluke, that it was the start of something real, something that could change his life. The fear was still there in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure if this would work in the long run, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to let this chance slip away. There was something bigger on the horizon, and he was ready to see where it would take him. The weeks that followed were a blur. Daniel felt like he was caught in a whirlwind, constantly moving, constantly learning. Every free moment he had outside of work was spent in his apartment, experimenting with the 3D printer, taking orders, and building his small business. He had no idea how far this would go or where it would take him, but each new print felt like a small victory. Each successful design made him feel like he was getting closer to something bigger. And though the orders were still modest, they were enough to keep him going, to fuel his hope that maybe, just maybe, he could turn this side project into something real. The hardest part, though, was the balance. He worked full-time at the repair shop, where the days were long and the work was physical. Then at night, after a quick dinner, he would go home and spend hours at his desk, designing, printing, troubleshooting, and responding to customers. At first, it didn't feel like work. It felt like excitement, like a new hobby that was somehow both challenging and rewarding. But the novelty wore off as the demands started to increase. There were more orders to fill, more problems to solve, and more pressure to keep up. Sometimes Daniel found himself working until 2 or 3 in the morning, his eyes heavy, his back sore. One night, after a long, grueling shift at the shop, Daniel came home to find a message from a customer. She was looking for a custom part for an old car model, one that was no longer in production. It wasn't a simple request. The part was intricate, with several moving pieces that had to fit together perfectly. Daniel wasn't sure if he could pull it off, but there was something about the challenge that pushed him forward. He spent the next several days designing the part, adjusting measurements, refining the details. There were countless moments when he thought about giving up, about saying it was too complicated. But he didn't. He kept tweaking, kept learning, kept trying. And when the part finally printed, it was flawless. It clicked together like it was meant to be. Daniel couldn't believe it. He had done it. The customer was thrilled. She left a glowing review and shared her experience with friends. Soon after, other people began reaching out asking for custom parts for their own projects, parts that weren't available anywhere else. Some were looking for replacements for broken appliances, others for gadgets that had been discontinued. It became clear that there was a niche market for custom 3D printed parts, and Daniel was in the perfect position to fill it. Still, as the orders grew, so did the pressure. Daniel began to feel overwhelmed. He was working more hours than he ever had before. Some nights he barely slept. His friends and family started to notice that he seemed tired all the time. He would cancel plans, put off social gatherings, and even stop returning calls. He wasn't trying to shut people out, but there just wasn't time for anything but work in his new business. One evening, as he sat at his desk working on another complicated design, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, we're having a barbecue this Saturday. You in?" Daniel stared at the message for a long time. Part of him wanted to go, to reconnect with old friends and forget about work for a few hours. But another part of him felt guilty. He still had orders to fill, designs to finish, and ideas that needed to be tested. Every time he thought about taking a break, he felt like he was falling behind. It wasn't long before he realized he was running on empty. The excitement that had once driven him started to feel like a weight, like something he had to do rather than something he wanted to do. His passion for 3D printing was still there, but it was buried under a mountain of stress and exhaustion. One night after another late work session, Daniel sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his tired face. He had been working nonstop for weeks, and yet it felt like he wasn't getting anywhere. The business was growing, but he was barely keeping up. The pressure was building, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it up. That's when it hit him. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. The thought was both a relief and a frustration. He didn't want to ask for help. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't do everything on his own. But the truth was he couldn't, not without burning out. The next day, Daniel reached out to a few people he trusted, friends who had experience in business or marketing. He explained his situation and asked for advice. To his surprise, they were more than willing to help. One friend had a background in marketing and offered to help him with social media. Another friend was an accountant and offered to help with the financial side of things. It was a small start, but it was enough to take a little bit of the weight off his shoulders. With their help, Daniel was able to streamline his business. He focused more on the designs and production, while his friends helped with promotion and bookkeeping. Slowly but surely, the pressure began to ease. He still worked long hours, but it felt more manageable now. He could breathe again. The more he worked with his friends, the more he realized something important. He didn't have to do everything by himself. He didn't have to carry the entire burden. The idea that he could build something on his own was important, but it didn't mean he had to do it alone. And the more he embraced that idea, the more things seemed to fall into place. As the weeks went by, Daniel began to refine his process. He invested in better equipment, purchased higher quality materials, and started to experiment with more complex designs. He was learning fast, both about the business side of things and about himself. The more he learned, the more confident he became. Soon he began to notice something else. His work wasn't just about making money or fulfilling orders anymore. It was about solving problems. People came to him with issues they couldn't solve on their own, and he had the tools to help them. That was what drove him now. The chance to make something useful, something that helped others in ways that didn't always involve money. One evening, a local charity reached out. They were working on a project to help low-income families fix their broken appliances, and they needed custom 3D printed parts to repair a few old refrigerators. They couldn't afford to buy brand new parts, and the appliances had been sitting in storage for months. It was a small request, but it felt meaningful. Daniel agreed to help. Over the next few days, he printed the parts they needed. When he delivered them, the team was thrilled. They didn't just see a piece of plastic. They saw a solution. And that felt better than any paycheck. Daniel realized that this wasn't just about making money. It was about creating something that made a difference. The business kept growing. Slowly, Daniel built a reputation. People started to come to him with bigger projects, more complex designs. Some were local, others came from far away. His website started to generate traffic, and soon people were reaching out from across the country. But the best part was how it made him feel. Every time he completed an order, solved a problem, or delivered a custom part, he felt like he was doing something important. The tiredness didn't feel as heavy anymore. The stress was still there, but it wasn't the same kind of stress. It was the kind of stress that came from doing something you cared about, something you knew mattered. And the more he embraced that, the more everything else seemed to fall into place. The fear of failure was still there, of course. It wasn't easy, but with each new design, each new order, each new connection he made, Daniel felt more certain that he was on the right path. His small $500 investment had led to more than just a side business. It had led to a discovery about himself, about his abilities, and about the power of taking a chance. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel was excited about the future. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. As the months passed, Daniel's small business continued to grow in ways he hadn't imagined. The more he worked with his friends to manage the business, the more streamlined everything became. He was still learning, still making mistakes, but the difference now was that he had built something he could be proud of. It wasn't just the money, though that was nice, but the satisfaction of creating something that people actually needed and appreciated. Each week brought something new. Sometimes it was a complicated part for an industrial machine. Other times it was a one-off item for a personal project, but there was always something. And with each order, Daniel felt like he was moving further into uncharted territory, like he was on the verge of discovering something even bigger. There were still a lot of challenges. There were days when the printer would break down, or the designs would fail, or an order would get delayed. But those were the moments that taught him the most. He learned how to troubleshoot, how to adapt, how to keep pushing forward even when things didn't go as planned. And then one day, a customer reached out with an idea that changed everything. It was something Daniel had never thought about before. The customer was a local artist who worked with sculptures, and they needed a 3D printed base for one of their pieces. They had a rough design in mind, but they weren't sure if it was possible to make it work. Daniel had done some art-related projects in the past, but this was different. The artist's design was complex, intricate, and far beyond anything he had done before. But there was something about it that excited him. The challenge, the creativity, the idea of combining technology with art. The first time Daniel saw the design, it seemed almost impossible. It had so many curves, twists, and delicate details that it didn't seem like something a 3D printer could replicate. But the more he looked at it, the more he saw the potential. He could do it. It would take time, patience, and a lot of trial and error, but he could do it. For the next few days, Daniel dove deep into the project. He tweaked the design, adjusted the measurements, and experimented with different types of materials. He printed test pieces, made adjustments, and printed again. The first few tries were a disaster. The part came out warped, or the details didn't show up right, or the colors were off. But with each failure, Daniel grew more determined. He spent hours learning about the right settings for the printer, reading up on the materials he was using, and talking to others in the 3D printing community about how to handle the complexities of artistic designs. Finally, after several long nights, Daniel had a prototype. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. The base of the sculpture was coming to life. He was proud of it, but he knew there was still more work to do. So he printed again, and again. With each new version, the design became clearer, more refined. The printer hummed steadily in the background, each pass of the nozzle laying down layer after layer of plastic, and Daniel watched in awe as the design began to take shape. When the final piece was done, Daniel could hardly believe it. It was beautiful. The curves were smooth, the details sharp, and the colors vibrant. It was exactly what the artist had envisioned, and maybe even a little better. He carefully packed it up and delivered it to the customer. When the artist saw the base, their eyes lit up with excitement. They were thrilled. "This is perfect," they said. "I couldn't have asked for anything better." That moment marked a turning point for Daniel. The success of that project didn't just feel like another job well done. It felt like something bigger. This wasn't just about making replacement parts or small gadgets anymore. It was about creating things that could change the way people thought about art, design, and technology. The possibilities were endless. Word of Daniel's work began to spread. He started to get more requests for art-related projects, sculptures, architectural models, even custom designs for people's homes. It was exciting, but it also brought a new set of challenges. These projects required more creativity, more problem-solving, and more attention to detail than anything he had done before. But Daniel was ready for it. He had proven to himself that he could handle the technical side of 3D printing. Now it was time to explore the creative side. But as his business grew, so did the pressure. He couldn't keep up with everything on his own. The orders were coming in faster than ever, and there were times when he felt like he was drowning in work. He had to make a choice. He could either keep doing everything himself and risk burning out, or he could bring in more help. After a lot of thought, Daniel decided it was time to hire someone. He posted an ad online looking for a part-time assistant to help with the design and printing process. The response was overwhelming. There were so many people interested in working with him, people who were passionate about 3D printing, people with experience in design, and even people with backgrounds in art. After conducting several interviews, Daniel hired a young woman who had just graduated with a degree in industrial design. She was eager to learn, and her enthusiasm was contagious. With his new assistant on board, things began to shift. Daniel was able to focus more on the big picture aspects of the business, the creative side, the marketing, and the customer relationships, while his assistant handled more of the day-to-day tasks. It was a huge relief. Finally, he could step back a little and catch his breath. Together, they took on bigger projects. They started working with local businesses, designing promotional materials and even creating prototypes for new products. The scope of their work expanded beyond what Daniel had originally imagined. His little side project was becoming something much larger, something he hadn't dared to dream about in the beginning. But even as the business grew, Daniel didn't forget why he started. He remembered the late nights, the frustration, and the feeling of excitement when the first print came out just right. He remembered the people who took a chance on him in the early days, and how he had been able to help them with their projects. It wasn't just about building a business. It was about building something that made a difference in people's lives. As the business expanded, Daniel began to think about the future. He wasn't content with just doing the same thing day after day. He wanted to push the boundaries of what was possible with 3D printing. He wanted to create things that hadn't been made before, to experiment with new materials and technologies. He thought about all the industries that could benefit from 3D printing: medicine, education, architecture, even space exploration. The potential was limitless, but with that big picture vision came a sense of responsibility. Daniel realized that if he wanted to take his business to the next level, he would need to make some big decisions. He would need to invest in more advanced equipment, hire more people, and perhaps even expand into new markets. It was both exciting and terrifying. The risk was greater now, but so were the rewards. If he succeeded, his business could become something truly special. But if he failed, it could all come crashing down. The uncertainty weighed on him, but Daniel knew that he had come a long way since that first $500 investment. He had built something from nothing, and he wasn't ready to stop now. The lessons he had learned along the way, the importance of perseverance, the power of creativity, and the value of asking for help, were guiding him as he faced these new challenges. As he sat in his office late one night, looking over the designs for his next big project, Daniel felt a surge of excitement. There was so much more to explore, so much more to create, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. The $500 investment had led him to this point, to a business that was growing faster than he ever expected. But more than that, it had led him to a new way of thinking. A way of thinking that saw opportunity in every challenge, that saw possibility in every problem. And as he looked ahead, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. As the business grew, Daniel felt both excitement and pressure building inside him. Each success was a step forward, but the weight of the responsibility continued to grow. He found himself at a crossroads, standing at the edge of something bigger than he had ever imagined, yet unsure of how to take the next step. It was easy to get caught up in the daily grind, focusing only on the tasks in front of him. But the bigger vision, his dream of building something truly impactful, was always there, just out of reach, like a star in the night sky. In the beginning, it had been all about taking small steps. The first $500 investment had seemed like a gamble, a chance he took without knowing where it would lead. But now the stakes felt higher. His business wasn't just a side project anymore. It was his life. It was everything he had worked for, and the thought of losing it was terrifying. But that fear also drove him. Daniel realized that if he didn't push himself, if he didn't take the leap, he might never know how far he could go. The doubt was always there, lingering in the background, but so was his belief in what he was building. He had learned so much over the past few months, about the business, about 3D printing, and most importantly, about himself. And now, he had to decide whether he was ready to go all in, to take the risks that came with scaling up. One evening, after a long day of work, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, looking at his laptop. He had a stack of new project proposals in front of him, some of them big, some of them small. Some were simple orders for replacement parts, while others were intricate designs for startups looking to create prototypes for new products. The variety was exciting, but it was also overwhelming. How could he possibly handle all of this on his own? He had already hired one assistant, but it was clear that he would need more help if he was going to take on larger projects. The question was, how could he afford it? Hiring another employee, upgrading his equipment, expanding his business, all of these things came with costs, and the uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on him. Could he sustain this growth? Was there a market for what he was doing? What if the business grew too quickly and he couldn't keep up? The fear of failure had never been so real. As he sat there thinking, Daniel realized something. He had been asking himself the wrong questions. Instead of worrying about what might go wrong, he needed to focus on what could go right. He had already proven that his work was valuable. He had customers who trusted him, a reputation that was growing, and a skill set that was constantly improving. The foundation was solid. Now it was time to build on it. So Daniel made a decision. He would take the leap. He would invest in new equipment, hire more people, and push the business to the next level. But he didn't want to do it recklessly. He needed a plan. He needed to be strategic, to make sure that every move he made was calculated and intentional. He spent the next few days researching, reaching out to mentors, and talking to others in the 3D printing industry. He wanted to understand the market, to learn from others who had been through the same process of growth. It was a humbling experience, but it gave him the confidence he needed to move forward. With a new sense of purpose, Daniel started looking for more help. This time, he wasn't just looking for someone to assist with printing and design. He needed people who could help with sales, marketing, and customer service. He needed a team that could help him scale without losing the personal touch that had made his business successful in the first place. He posted job listings, attended networking events, and reached out to people he knew in the industry. It wasn't long before he found a few great candidates, people who were not only skilled but passionate about 3D printing and excited about the opportunity to be part of something bigger. Hiring the right people was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to build a team that shared his vision. Daniel was careful to choose individuals who were not just looking for a paycheck, but who genuinely believed in the work they were doing. In the meantime, Daniel also began upgrading his equipment. He invested in a higher quality 3D printer, one that could handle more complex projects and produce faster, more precise prints. He also upgraded his software to allow for more advanced design work. It was a big financial commitment, but he knew it would pay off in the long run. As the new team members settled in and the new equipment was up and running, Daniel started to see the results of his hard work. The workload was no longer overwhelming. The team was efficient, and the new printer was able to produce high-quality work faster than ever before. With his team handling the daily operations, Daniel was able to focus on the bigger picture, looking for new business opportunities, expanding his client base, and exploring new markets. But even with all the progress, there were still moments of doubt. It was natural. There were days when things didn't go as planned, when orders were delayed, or when a design didn't turn out quite right. There were times when Daniel felt like he was taking one step forward and two steps back. But with every setback, he learned something valuable. He learned to embrace mistakes as part of the process, to see them as opportunities to grow rather than failures. And with each challenge, he grew more confident in his ability to handle whatever came his way. One day, after a particularly challenging week, Daniel sat down with his team for a meeting. They had just completed a big project, a custom order for a company looking to prototype a new product. It had been a difficult project, with a tight deadline and several obstacles along the way. But they had completed it on time, and the client was thrilled with the result. "We did it," Daniel said, looking around the room. "This is what we've been working for. We're not just printing parts anymore. We're building something." His team nodded, smiling. There was a sense of pride in the air. They had come a long way together. What had started as a small side project had now become a growing business, one that was making a real impact. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the work they were doing, the difference they were making, and that was something Daniel could be proud of. As the business continued to grow, Daniel began to think about the future in a new way. The possibilities were endless. He could continue to expand into new markets, take on bigger projects, and push the boundaries of what was possible with 3D printing. He could even start thinking about how to give back, to use his success to help others, to create opportunities for people who might not have had a chance otherwise. He had come so far, but he knew there was still so much to do. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. One evening, as he sat in his office reflecting on how far he had come, Daniel realized something important. The $500 investment that had started it all was still the best decision he had ever made. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the late nights, the risks, the challenges, and the triumphs. That small amount of money had sparked something inside him, something that had driven him to take chances, to work hard, and to never give up. But it wasn't just the money that had made the difference. It was the willingness to believe in himself, to trust that he could create something meaningful from nothing. It was the courage to take that first step, even when he didn't know where it would lead. And as he looked ahead to the future, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just building a business. He was building something that could make a difference. He was part of a movement that saw technology not as a replacement for creativity but as a tool to enhance it. The journey had been long, but it had been worth every moment. As the business grew, Daniel knew that he was no longer alone. He had built a team of people who shared his passion, his vision, and his commitment to creating something special. Together, they were building something that could last, not just for a few years, but for generations to come. The $500 investment had been just the beginning. The real adventure was only starting.